Hi guys, Gabi from UiPath Hacks here. I'm quite excited about today's video. I will be explaining the Enhanced REFramework. It was brought to my attention by a community member, and at the beginning I had a hard time understanding what it does differently than the standard REFramework. I think I found about 20 forum posts, all with questions about it and very little partial answers. And there is, at this time, only one other video on YouTube describing the enhanced REFramework, but it stays quite high level, and the example provided there does not really use the enhanced framework as it was designed to be used with all the different tasks, but rather it is used as a normal REFramework, not making use of the additional child frameworks. Now, I've put a lot of effort in researching this topic and preparing this video, so if you find it useful, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel if you are new here. This video will explain the enhanced REFramework and often compare it to the classic REFramework. So for a good understanding of the enhanced REFramework, please watch my other two tutorials on the beginner and advanced level on the REFramework. Without a sound understanding of what the REFramework is, it will be hard for you to get some of the points of this tutorial. Now, something important to mention from the beginning, this is not an official UiPath REFramework. It was developed by an UiPath employee, Mihai Dunăreanu, in September 2018. And as he himself states on one of the answers to the questions on the marketplace, there is no official support for it, at least at the time of making this video. But that being said, this is definitely something worth investigating and understanding, a tool to have in your toolbox. It is not meant to replace the standard REFramework, but in some more complex cases, it could be quite useful. So an important question we have to answer is, when could we use it over the standard REFramework, and what is it really? The short version of the answer is, it is a hierarchical set of REFrameworks with a parent framework and many child frameworks. In the standard REFramework, we would typically have a process transaction workflow from where we would invoke other workflows performing the business processes. The enhanced REFramework is kind of doing the same thing, but instead of invoking just simple workflows, it is invoking other full-blown frameworks. Now, when should we use it? Well, because we call other frameworks instead of simpler workflows, one of the scenarios where it becomes powerful is in more complex processes, where, for example, we get a list of items to be processed, but the way they should be processed in is quite complex and different one case to another. Let's say we are receiving a flow of scanned documents, and at the entry point, we have an OCR process with a classification model, which differentiates the types of documents that were being scanned. Some of them are delivery notes, for example, and others are invoices. Now, processing the two categories happens in completely different ways, might happen in different systems, and would potentially have different points in which exceptions might occur. So, posting delivery notes and posting invoices could very well be done in two different REFrameworks, two different projects by themselves. And this is the idea of the enhanced REFramework. There is one parent REFramework to rule them all. So any number of child frameworks called tasks or services doing the main work. Now let's have a look at the actual framework. First, some new terms. The enhanced REFramework is built on layers. The framework layer deals with the framework stuff we don't need to touch in principle. Reads the config file data, etc. And some of these workflows we know from the standard framework. But there they were all put together in the same framework folder. Then the process layer or business process layer is here kept separately. This is where we might want to write some code of our own to implement the business logic. Again, most of these frameworks here sound familiar from the standard framework. Then we have the data layer, and this is the config file plus some other input or output files. And in addition, we have the services layer. This consists of multiple tasks and each task is a framework by itself. We have the FirstRun and getData tasks plus any number of additional tasks. They are blank framework placeholders. They have their own main and their own process layer and data layer, and we could fill in here the data that we need. Now, tasks 1 and 2 are not invoked automatically by the parent framework. They should be invoked manually in the process transaction XAML file of the main parent framework. While FirstRun and getData can be switched on and off from the main config file. Now let's look at the main workflow of the parent REFramework. We have here some additional boxes that were not in the standard REFramework. And we have the concept of work blocks. What is a work block? We have one parent work block and many child work blocks. And a work block has 3 stages. We have a try-catch, and inside it we have a work block startup. Here we have the work block name, we have a path for the work block, we have a starting time, some other defaults and log fields, and of course the log message that the work block has started. Then we have the main body or the execution, and here we see a state machine diagram very similar to the one from the standard REFramework, and at the end we have the logging after the workflow has finished. Now let's look at the init state implementation of the main workflow. This is here initializing all settings, and it's reading inside it the config file. After that it's calling the cleanup and prep workflow. This runs once per process and we can prepare all our environment here, and afterwards it is running the main workflow from the FirstRun services layer if some conditions are being met. And it's important that this section, if we look at the conditions, this section will only run once for transaction 1, will not be retried, and it only runs if we have the system task1 enable equals 1 in the config file. So if we open the main config file, we have here in tasks some parameters. We have a system task1 underscore enable and a system task2 underscore enable. And the first one is for the FirstRun task, so the first one subfolder in the services layer. And the second one is for the getData workflow or framework that is found also in the services layer. So the first two are being switched on and off by these 2 fields here in the config file. While the other ones we would have to call manually from the process transaction workflow later on, meaning task 1, 2, or any other tasks. So the fact that the FirstRun chunk is only being executed once, it's making it safe, for example, to have here dispatcher, for example, and it will be guaranteed to get executed only once, even if we will get a system exception and the framework needs to restart. All right? Then going back to the framework, we have the get transaction or get set transaction data state. We have a big try catch, and inside it we check first if we have any stop signal from orchestrator, same as we do in the standard REFramework. And later on in the process we have an if again. We are checking if we have the system task2 enable set in config, and if we do, then we call the main workflow of the services layer getData framework, so this one over here. After that it calls the get set transaction data of the process layer. Then the process transaction state, again a try catch, and we have here calling get qmax retries workflow. This is to make sure it does not exceed the allowed number of retries, and afterwards it calls the process transaction inside the process layer workflow. And this is pretty much similar to what the standard framework was doing. And then at the end we have the end process state, and here we have basically the close all applications workflow. It's nothing really special here besides the standard boxes of the work block with logging. And if you look at the child workflows, so meaning the ones in the services layer, let's open the one for task 1, for example. We have a main workflow. It looks like this. So again, very similar to the main one. And then we have here in the process layer the cleanup and prep, close all applications, get set transaction data, and they are all placeholders or blank workflows where we can implement our business code logic. They have their own data layer with their own config file and so on. Okay, we are now ready for a demo. So I will not save this. Just to save time, I will show the framework I've already modified and built on this, but point to all the areas where I had to add or change something. So first thing, after downloading this from the marketplace, I had to solve some dependencies. I had to install two packages that were the UiPath Credentials Activities package to solve a dependency in the Get App Credentials workflow. And I had to install also the UiPath Web API Activities to get rid of an error about Newtonsoft JSON link. So after that's out of the way, to allow us to focus on the actual framework rather than on a complex use case, I chose a simple business process, but that still can make use of the child frameworks. And that's adding up items from two columns when we are not sure the data types that we will have to deal with. If the elements are both numbers, then Task1 will sum them up. And if the elements are not numbers, then Task2 will concatenate the strings instead. So the use case is very simple, but we will concentrate on the structure of the framework and what do we have to add and modify where to make it work. So we will have a dispatcher creating queue items with the two values, and we will then process them, sum or concatenate them, and at the end log the result. So here are the steps we need to take to implement this process with the Enhanced REFramework. 1. We have to update the two config files. One is found at the parent level in data config. Let's open it. And here we have two things. We have to put the system task1 enable on 1 because we plan to use the FirstRun task as a dispatcher. And we have as well to add the queue name in the orchestrator queue name in the settings sheet. And then if we go to the services layer, FirstRun, data, and config file again, here we have just to put the orchestrator queue name. Then the second step, we are here in the data layer of the FirstRun task. And here in input, we have to create the actual data Excel with the numbers to be added up. So I've created this input Excel here and added two columns. We have 3 lines. 2 of them are with numbers. 1 of them is with words. Then we can switch to Studio. And here we have to create the logic for the dispatcher in the services layer, FirstRun, process layer, and then get set transaction data. And here in the process sequence, I'm just reading the Excel file created in the previous step. I have here a DT input data table. Then for each row in the data table, I'm adding a queue item. And I have the queue here, the one set up in config. And as an item information, I have here 2 columns with called number 1 and number 2, where I'm storing the numbers or texts as string. So we have created the dispatcher. This is the dispatcher in the framework of the task FirstRun. Now that we have dispatcher, we have to take care about the performers. And we have to make sure we have the mechanism to get the items one by one in the parent framework. So if we go to the process layer and we open here the get set transaction data, that'll be this one. We see here in the process sequence that we have a get transaction item. We have the queue name, again, from config file, and we are pulling from there one queue item, the IO transaction item. We look at the arguments, and that's of type queue item. So we have the dispatcher creating items for us, and then the get set transaction data of the main workflow or the parent workflow is pulling the queue items one by one with this logic here. After that, the next step is the process transaction of the main workflow. So we're getting now our data that was created by the dispatcher, and we have to see what we do with it. And here I've implemented simple sequence. Let's make it a bit smaller so you can see it. I have here a data table with the two columns, number 1 and number 2 of type string. Then I'm adding a data row with the actual data from the queue. So transaction item, specific content, number 1 and number 2. And then I'm getting a data row, dr_numbers, as the first row of this data table. And afterwards, I'm getting also a list of data rows, list numbers. I'm just creating a new list of data rows with this one above. So list of data row, new data row, and then their numbers. And that's because later on here, I am invoking the main workflow of the Task1 framework. And in the arguments, I have the path, a string, and as well an input-output transaction data argument of type list of data row. So I need to pass it a list of data rows rather than a data table, for example. So if we go back to our implementation here, after I'm creating this list of data rows, I am then checking here. I have an if, and in the if, I'm checking basically if both elements are numeric. So I have the information.isNumeric of the contents of the queue item. And if they are both numeric, I'm just logging this for debugging purposes. And afterwards, I'm calling the main workflow of the Task1 framework. Now you see, I've been testing before and commenting this out. I was also calling directly the process transaction workflow from Task1, but I realized this kind of cheating or not really using the full child workflows, but rather just calling one specific workflow from it. And that doesn't use the full functionality of the child framework. So if I would be calling directly the process transaction from the child framework, it's pretty much like having the standard REFramework, just with this FirstRun addition to it, but not really using the additional child frameworks properly. All right, so I'm doing the same thing then on the else here. If we don't have real numbers and we have texts, then I'm calling the main workflow of the Task2 framework. So if we look at the arguments of these tasks, we have the path here, a string, and the list of data rows that we've just prepared before for the IO transaction data. So let's go to the get set transaction data of Task1, for example, to simplify. It's here in the process layer. Let's close the previous ones so we don't get confused as they have similar names. And here in the process sequence, I'm just logging the transaction number just for debugging purposes. And I'm kind of making sure I'm only running this once, otherwise I will run an infinite loop. So I'm saying here basically if the transaction number is 1, and if it is, then I'm assigning the input-output transaction item to the one being passed as an argument. So IO transaction data 0. So the first element of this list of data rows, so the first data row that I'm passing from the main, from the parent workflow. And if I'm not on the first run, then I'm assigning IO transaction item nothing. It means it will only process one item and stop afterwards. And we will see this in the logs after we run this at the end. And this logic right here, if you've seen my advanced framework video, where we were converting a repetitive non-queue framework to a non-repetitive one, we've seen there the same idea with setting the transaction number or checking the transaction number. If it's 1, then do something. If not, stop. All right, then one small modification I had to do is in the main workflow of the Task1 and Task2 respectively, in the get set transaction data state. If we look at invoking the get set transaction data XAML, if we look at the arguments, there was here before just the transaction data without the IO in front. And this is how it is normally in the standard framework. And the issue with that is that we need to use here actually the argument data we got from the parent framework. So by putting IO underscore in front, we are making sure we pass over, when we're processing the data in the Task1 framework, the data we get from the parent framework, from the main framework. So this is one change I had to do here. Instead of transaction data, I had to put IO transaction data to actually get the data I'm passing over in the process transaction of the main framework. So the one right here, where I was sending this list of numbers as the IO transaction data. And the last thing we have to do, step number 9, is to go to task 1 and then to task 2 as well and fill in the process transaction workflow. Here I have the logic for summing up the numbers. For example, for task 1, I'm just adding them up. I'm converting them to int and I'm summing them up and just logging the result. And it's very similar in task 2. So I've done here everything that I've done in task 1 as well. And in the process transaction, I have here a very slightly different implementation logic, where instead of adding up to numbers, I'm just concatenating two strings. And that was it. So we have about 9 steps that we needed to do. So if I'm now closing everything here and running the main framework, we should get the results. It's running now. And here it is. We have no errors, right? And let's see what happened. So we can look at the output. The execution of the main framework has started. Then we have the FirstRun task being executed. Then we have the get set transaction data from the FirstRun task running and ended with success. Then we have the get set transaction data execution started. And after that has ended, we get the process transaction workflow started. That's summing up the numbers. I have some log messages here. So we had 2 and 5 first from the input file. The input file was here. We have 2, 5, 1, 2 as text and 3, 7. And after that, we have some log messages here. And the result is 7. That's being calculated by the process transaction in task 1. Then we get the transaction number 2, and we have set that to nothing, so we stop here. This is happening in the parent framework, where we're checking if transaction is equal to number 1. If not, then we just stop. Then we go to get set transaction data again of the main workflow. We get the next item, which is the one with 2 texts, 1 and 2. We are processing that. We get the result 1, 2, concatenated. We have the same steps, and then at the end we process the third one with the numbers 3 and 7. They are being calculated, the result is 10, and then pretty much we wrap up and close. And that was it. We have seen what the enhanced REFramework is and when it could be used over the standard REFramework. We have looked at its structure and overall implementation, and at the end we have seen a simple demo that makes use of the main new functionality of the enhanced REFramework. If you got to the end of this long video, I congratulate you. This is just my understanding of the framework based on my own research and testing. And if you have anything to add or correct, please do it in the comment section below. We will all appreciate your feedback. This also took quite some time and effort to prepare, so I would really appreciate if you would hit the like button and also consider subscribing to my channel, as this would incentivize YouTube to promote such videos higher in the search algorithm. Thank you for watching and have a great day.